Welcome to my series into the world of Black musicals, their history, and hopefully at the end of the series we can consider the question of what is a Black musical. Today we'll be talking about the well-noted musical called The Color Purple and its revival. This particular musical is interesting because it's based on two previous sources. Its 1982 novel by Alice Walker and its 1985 film by Steven Spielberg. This particular musical is near and dear to my heart, along with its original source, as I deeply connect with its characters' struggle to survive and find beauty in their white-centric world. The Color Purple's plot revolves around a young girl named Celie who goes on an intense life journey after she is sent to live with a man named Mr. She's sent by her father who sexually and verbally abuses her due to her ugliness. The only thing in life that Celie cares about is her children and her sister Nettie, who is eventually banned from Mr.'s house. But she has to learn to become her own person, not so dependent on her beautiful and intelligent sister. Yet, so much more happens in the story that it's kind of hard to boil down to just one central theme, so keep that in mind. The musical itself premiered in 2005 at the Broadway Theater in New York City, but before that it had a workshop in Atlanta, Georgia at the Alliance Theater. The original production starred LaChanze as Celie, Brandon Victor Dixon as Harpo, Felicia P. Fields as Sophia, Renee Elise Goldsberry as Nettie, Kingsley Leggs as Mr., Krista Marcano as Squeak, and Elizabeth Winters Mendez as Shug Avery, along with an ensemble cast. So, before we get into the musical, let's talk about its previous inspirations. Walker herself was just as influential and controversial as her book. But what's important to note is that she wrote more than 9 novels and poetry books. If you'd like to dig deeper on Alice Walker, I recommend the book In Search for the Color Purple and Unveiling the Silence, No, the Rape Documentary and Study Guide, along with James Baldwin's essay titled Negroes Are Anti-Semitic Because They're Anti-White. It's a pretty dense selection, but it's essentially very helpful in knowing more about Alice Walker and her novels. If you can take really one thing away from Walker, even with her flaws, it's that she centers her work on Black women and young girls. That's really important to Walker. The novel was published by Harcourt in 1982, and the book went on to win the 1983 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Award for Fiction. It should be noted that Alice was the first Black woman to ever win a Pulitzer, which is pretty amazing. Once again, the musical does stick to the novel story, which focuses on the life of many African American women and men in the southern United States in the 1930s. It addresses numerous issues that revolve around the placement of Black women in society and the white-centric oppression of Black people at the time. The interesting thing about these books is that it managed to show kind of white supremacist oppression without the large inclusion of white people dominating the narrative. Unlike the film, which sometimes does this. Here, Black women, in the form of letters, get to tell their own stories. Salamisha Tillett states that Alice Walker is trying to get us to close the rhythm of the language as possible. Alice said that she wanted to write a book that her mother would be able to read, her mother from Edenton, Georgia, and that's also why she did the film eventually. This is the first novel that we have language that has richness and the flexibility and the fluidity of Black Southern vernacular speech as the primary language of the novel. Although the book is influential, it has become one of the most frequently challenged or banned books because of its sexual themes and exploration of sexuality, its explicit language, and violence, which is what sometimes keeps it out of schools. But then at the same time I question this because schools still allow us to openly read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Great Gatsby. So I think the difference with this one is misogyny and sexism. It also received greater scrutiny amidst the depiction of Black men, which some critics saw as feeding stereotypical narratives of Black male violence, while others found the representation compelling and relatable. Again, while men are violent and cruel in the novel, but even more so in the white-directed film, this is sometimes the experience of Black women in America. According to the Institute for Women's Policy and Research, it states more than 4 in 10 Black women experience physical violence from an intimate partner during their lifetimes. Black women also experience significantly higher rates of psychological abuse. Sexual violence affects Black women at high rates. More than 20% of Black women are raped during their lifetimes, and a higher share among the women overall, and that Black women face a particularly high risk of being killed at the hands of a man. A 2015 Violence Policy Center study finds that Black women are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered by men than their white counterparts. More than 9 in 10 Black female victims knew their killers. These hard-to-listen-to statistics, while the novel may exaggerate Black men, do highlight that maybe Walker's novel isn't as far from the truth as we'd like it to be. The truth is, in our own Black communities, and sometimes even in other communities, that these statistics are hard to face things, but it is a struggle that many Black authors have discussed, and in the end, Walker's essential question in the novel is, can Black women ever truly make amends with her abuser to find inner peace? That's certainly a powerful question, but it's also been conflicted, twisted, and taken by white people and the white gaze, which is why its film is even more complicated. Yet, the film is not really what I'm interested in this series. Right now, let's just focus on the 304-page novel itself and the production. Instead, we need to talk about the stereotypes being more enhanced once it's on the American stage, and that's even more important to mull over. I mean, should this musical have even ever been made? And what is the way in which people can combat the white gaze in plays and musicals, if that's even possible to combat? In order to understand if one can combat the white gaze on stage, we should get into the show's production history, as who creates something can also be sometimes inherently tied to its own gaze, but sometimes it doesn't. Bear with me, because this is going to include a lot of names, but it's important. Pay attention to the face of who and where people are. This original production was produced by Oprah Winfrey, Scott Sanders, Roy Furman, Quincy Jones, Anna Fatashi, Cheryl Lachowitz, the Independent Presenters Network, David Lowery, unfortunately the Weinstein brothers, Andrew Asnes, Adam Zachovich, and Todd Johnson. This is the first producing crew in the series to have kind of a mix of diverse faces. I mean, we can't exclude Oprah and Quincy Jones, which are kind of an essential crew. But what matters is who had a hand in its actual creation, in its lyrics, and its design. So let's get into that. The musical's director was Gary Griffin, and I can't deny that I was hoping it would be a Black woman or really any woman of color, but alas, and we'll talk about that later. The choreographer was Donald Byrd, the composer and lyricist was Brenda Russell, Stephen Bray, and Ali Williams. The librettist was Marcia Norman, and the musical director was Linda Twine. And orchestrations was Jonathan Tunick, and scenic design was John Lee Betty, lighting design was Brian McDevitt, and sound design was John Weston. Again, these are both kind of Black and white creative teams, which is interesting, but in 2005, it's really not as innovative as it could be. I mean, I could think on the top of my head, like 10 Black designers that they could have gone with. So it is quite interesting that instead they chose to go with a mostly white creative team. In its 2015 revival, which is just as largely, if not more popular than its original, for its cast was Cynthia Erivo, Jennifer Hudson, Danielle Brooks, Isaiah Johnson, Joaquina Caligo, Kyle Scalaffi, Phoenix Best, Dwayne Clark, Lawrence K. Clayton, Carrie Campari, Petrus Covington, Adriana Hicks, Bree Jackson, Rasan Kingsbury, Kevin Murrow, Ken Robinson, Antoine L. Smith, Carla R. Stewart, Akron Watson, and Rima Webb, which is quite a larger ensemble cast than the original, and I'll get to that in a second. But this time, the revival was directed by, again, a white man, whose name is John Dole. And again, as I mentioned before, why are we so resistant to put Black women as directors? In 2015, it would have been just as easy to find a Black woman willing to take on this show, not to mention that it probably could have propelled their career 10 times more. I mean, if Alice Walker always centered her stories on Black women, then why wouldn't we choose to have a Black director, especially one that's a woman? It once again just shows me and makes me feel like there's some sort of white male gaze that needs to exist on Broadway in order for things to be successful. And that's a big issue. I mean, Broadway needs to tackle it's not only racism, but also its misogyny, or else it will never succeed. Nevertheless, the sound design for the revival was Gregory Clark, the lighting design was Jane Cox, the costume design was Ann Holt Ward, orchestrations was Joseph Jobert, the producers were Scott Sanders, Roy Furman, Oprah Winfrey again, David Babani, and Tom Sakusa. This is interesting because instead of a mix of cast like was shown before, we've got a mainly white producing creative and design team, which kind of reverts back to everything that the original musical did, so that's kind of interesting. But let's move on to some of the set decoration. In the revival, the set decoration instead was mainly stripped of all set pieces and hung various chairs to symbolize a more toned-down world. According to a Theater Mania article, the original production of The Color Purple opened on Broadway a decade ago. It offered a cavalcade of scenery and costumes in an effort to cram as many plot points of Walker's novel as possible into 2 hours and 50 minutes. Doyle's nimble revival shaves about 30 minutes off without ever feeling rushed. In fact, actors often seem to saunter in a manner that conjures a hot Georgia afternoon. Doyle relies heavily on a simple yet highly specific gestures to tell a story. One woman place baskets on their head, and we know we're in Africa. Shug lazily spreads her legs apart while sitting on a chair and wearing a flesh-tone negligee to indicate she's in the bath. It works just as well as sliding in a tub in a scenery track. but takes far less time, money, and effort. The revival also included its cast to become the orchestra, along with an absence of the original overarching framing device, which included an I remember or dear reader structure. It certainly is a beautiful new type of revival with its gorgeous costumes and beautiful orchestrations, yet it's still important to remember that its creators were largely white people, largely white men, I should say, which complicates things. Aside from the creative cast and crew, there are a few iconic songs from the show. Honestly, I will say that every song in this musical slaps. To me, it's entirely encoded into blackness, and it really is kind of a special cast album. I mean, you won't really find an album that, every single song is good, but The Color Purple, every song is good. I also have to mention its inclusion of AAVE, which isn't wildly used in Broadway musicals as it alienates certain audiences, is really interesting, especially at the time. I mean, nowadays, if you think about it, we kind of know a lot more AAVE with the internet and with, more pop culture being put in the mainstream, but back then in 2005, it really wasn't done that often. The songs are super interesting in that they are inspired by Black various gospel music, jazz, call and response, Black storytelling, and soul music of the time. The music is both toe-tapping, rooted in Black churches, and extremely sentimental to me. Such as The Color Purple Reprise, which is a song that makes me cry almost every time I hear it, especially the revival version, as well as Somebody's Gonna Love You, Our Prayer, Too Beautiful for Words, and Miss Celie's Pants. There's also I'm Here, which is a solo ballad sung by Celie, and it's a pretty powerful song for Black women to sing both in the show and at auditions. I mean, we can listen to a tiny clip of it right now, but warning, it will give you chills. The song is about a journey in which Celie goes through a transformation of finding her own confidence and loving who she is regardless of what she looks like. I highly recommend that you listen to both of these songs on your own time. I mean, both versions are great, both the Cynthia Erivo version and the LaChanze. They both have different vibes, but I think they also really show the range in which Black women get to take this musical at its helm. Once again, there are many powerful themes in this musical and in the book overall. For instance, it's got dark scene representation, which we so rarely get to see on Broadway, not to mention that in this show, we get to see complex Black women who are not easily digestible. I mean, women like Shug Avery, Sophia, and Celie. This is once again rare on Broadway in general, but the fact that it's Black women is even more amazing. The Color Purple can often be cited as a dream role for many Black women in theater, and I get that completely. Yet, it's got a complicated history with the helm of white creatives, which makes it complex, but I don't think I can negate how much this musical centers on Black women explicitly, and the ways in which it tries its best to showcase the emotional turmoil and stress in which Black women go through without directly showcasing violence, unlike the movie. The original production also won a Tony for Best Actress, which once again goes to LaChanze. Remember, she was also in Once on This Island. However, its revival won 2 Tonys, including Best Revival and Best Actress, which goes to Cynthia Erivo, 2 Drama Desk, an Outer Critics Circle Award, a Grammy, and a Daytime Emmy Award, thanks to Cynthia again. Although I will say, Danielle Brooks was also in this revival, and she was nominated, and between me and you, she was robbed, and I think she should have won at least 1 award. There's even a film adaptation that is being released on December 20th, 2023. It's set to be written by Marcus Gardley, who is a poet and a playwright. Not to mention that Marcus Gardley is an ensemble member at Victory Garden Theater here in Chicago. And it will be directed by, I hope that I'm saying this right, Blitz Bazawule or Bazawuli, a Ghanaian artist. It's still got Black men though, at its helm, but I'm wondering where the Black directors and Black women creatives are. I mean, considering this meant a lot to Alice Walker, wouldn't it make sense to have a Black woman that's directing it? But I guess this is one step better, and I'm sure it's going to be amazing. Yet, we all know that from previous episodes, just having great accolades and getting a movie cannot make a show enough to be a Black musical. All of this info is obviously great, but we still have to get to the core question and hopefully answer of, is this a Black musical? Well, to that, let's look at a few quotes made about the production of the show and its receptions. For instance, let's look at what one Black creative said. Donald Bard, artistic director of Seattle Spectrum Dance Theater and the choreographer, was taking exception to online criticism of the show on Broadway Center blogs, lodged over press reviews weighed in. He bristled over references to the show as Oprahoma, a dig at Oprah Winfrey, one of the musical's producers. And he sees The Color Purple as a test of whether there's an audience for Broadway musicals that isn't just white and suburban. There is an undercurrent of racism in the Broadway scene that makes me sad, he says. There were these agents who didn't even want their people to audition for this, who said, black shows just don't sell, they won't run long. In some ways, Bard's year-long involvement with the musical, he came on board after the show's trial run at Atlanta's Alliance Theater, is rather surprising. He's viewed as a bold dance risk-taker. He is best known for his popular Harlem Nutcracker, among other edgy modern dance compositions. But he tells you, I've always been curious about the Broadway thing, and I thought that maybe I could contribute something to this piece. What he added were many more dance movements and moments integrating the full body of movement into the story of an African-American woman's triumph over abuse. He also devised an African-inspired ballet for the fantasy scene that didn't exist before a degree it does to now. He also had to adjust a small mob of producers giving their opinions on every aspect of the show. But Bard reports that neither Walker nor Winfrey tried to micromanage the effort. Alice Walker had just one note for us, that the God, the leader of Celie speaks to, isn't some patriarchal male image, but the God inside you. And I personally didn't hear any notes from Oprah. This quote is super interesting to me, as it notes that its black creatives really wanted to market this to black audiences. While their input wasn't often taken as seriously, people like Bard fought in order to create things that were coded in blackness for black audiences. So, in some ways, it creates a resistance to the white gaze, which is tied to its creation. This is also why its topic differs so much from its musical, and in its movie, which chooses to remove things. The Spielberg movie removes a lot of stuff in order to be more marketable, and it directly showcases violence, no matter how much I'm attached to the movie. Yet, on the other hand, according to one of the producers, Alice Walker met with the creative team behind the musical and advised them on what to expect from the material, encouraging them to have faith in the characters, all of whom have a reason for their behavior. It says, we want to remind them that, yes, there was this hard part, but ultimately it was a story of triumph. I think that's exactly what the story is, as we present it. It is Celie's march to freedom, her search for peace. This quote kind of complicates things, as it kind of relates to my conversation about Once on This Island. It showcases how often white producers don't always want nor care about black audiences, nor do they understand the ways in which their bias can impact the show. Again, why does Broadway always resort to the angle of black resilience and triumph for marketing to a white, gazy ploy? I mean, why do we showcase black women as totally resilient when in fact their struggles and their response is trauma? Why are black women marketed in the stereotype of strong, when in fact this show should be a lesson in how we need to stop relying on women as the backbone of everything? I mean, what happens to the many women who do not make it? And would this be rectified if black women were allowed to be the head of the creative team, besides just Oprah? Yet, Alice Walker at the same time seemed okay with this direction and had influence as they complied with her demands. So I guess that's something that further complicates it. I also can't negate the ways in which white critics praise the show through their white and male gaze without the proper intersection. For instance, Ben Brantley states, like the rest of the show, she, Celie, never oversells herself. She asks us politely but compellingly to listen, even when she speaks in a whisper. By the production's end, Celie has developed a muscular voice that reaches to the heaven, and Miss Arrivo has emerged as a bona fide star who lifts the audience to its feet. This is as it should be. Celie may have started off cowed and self-effacing, but we've always sensed that there's this rare spirit inside, just waiting to be coaxed to the surface. In these few short but telling sentences, there are like hints of racist, implicit attitudes towards black women, and this strange theater ideology that black women should speak up to be heard. That somehow the trauma that black women have makes us better, and in some ways it makes us better entertainment to see us struggle so much. And for me, that is problematic without proper nuances, which is why this musical is complicated, especially without the black women's voices that are heavily included in the novel, but not so much in the musical. This also complicates things as this critic is putting his own influence on what he thinks a musical is about black women, without proper intersectionality. And I guess that goes to say that there's some kind of issues with the way in which white male critics specifically, talk about Black shows. Maybe this would have been a better review for somebody else. So, again, is this a Black musical? Is The Color Purple a Black musical? I think that this musical is a Black musical, depending on who views it and how they view it. I mean, I can't 100% answer this question, but I will try my best. But what I can definitely say is that this is why we need to constantly interrogate our inherent gazes, so that we can see what our gaze on a musical is, and if that matters, and why that's important. While the show is definitely tied to its book source, which is inherently Black and written by Black women, and its music, including its cast, makes it inherently Black. I mean, there's a reason why Black women feel compelled to this work no matter who directs it. I think its intentions from Black creatives was that this show was meant for Black audiences. I know I, as a Black woman, have fallen in love with every iteration of The Color Purple. I always seem to deeply connect with Celie in ways that others just can't. For me, she kind of feels this deep pain of being rejected for how she looks, and I felt that same way often in a white, patriarchal, dominated world. I've often felt the kind of feeling rejected and different than others, but maybe that's because I know what it's like to be a Black woman, and I know the inherent ways in which Black women struggle, and that our trauma is not for resilient entertainment. For this, I'm glad that the musical decided not to grotesquely submit women to violence on stage. I mean, everything violently that happens in this musical mainly happens off stage or through a word of mouth, but the emotions are still there. This is also very different because the movie shows direct, explicit violence in ways in which the book and the musical kind of don't. I've also seen other Black women in the audiences deeply connect with the depictions shown in this musical, and there's validity in the many ways in which Black women desire to play each character. That being said, white audiences, if their gazes are not properly explored and broken down, might view this show in a way that can be exploitative. For instance, they might see Black men as the villain instead of seeing the show and how it's actually their white oppression and their white supremacy that makes Black men this way. They might also see characters like Sophia or the many various gospel numbers as like a stereotypical form of entertainment. This is pretty dangerous, and I think this is why we need things to be properly intersected, and we need to explore how we can tackle the white gaze, or is it even important to do so in the context of this musical? This is gonna be a bit complex, but I mean, you can handle it. You've seen my other videos, and I'm not stating that this musical isn't problematic, because it is. But maybe Black audiences deserve a show that is about them. Maybe we rely too much on what white people see, and maybe that's why Alice Walker, whose whole point is not to center on anyone but Black women. I mean, she did sit through this musical, she did know that it was happening, and she was okay with it. So, I guess I'll close with this. Considering that there are not many musicals like this, maybe instead of focusing on how white people see musicals such as this or this particular musical, it's better to also focus on how Black women view them. Just like in the ways Black women like myself are deeply able to resonate with Celie, which I think is valid. I think the interesting thing is that white creatives who put on the show need to also intersect their own whiteness and their own gaze, without allowing only Black women like myself to break down their gazes. What I mean by that is, throughout this whole series, I've been kind of talking about how the white gaze is very apparent in certain musicals and not as apparent in others. But while doing my research, I found that very little white creatives never stopped to take a second and think, should I make this? Is this in my wheelhouse? They all kind of just did it, which I think is super problematic. But I also think, why do I always have to investigate this? Can't I put my own Black gaze on a musical? I mean, isn't that what coding is? Putting your own Blackness into something? Or I guess maybe not coding is the right word, but something in the form of that. Shouldn't I do that as well with other Broadway musicals? I mean, while Broadway needs to deeply dissect how white people and white creatives often feel and their need to kind of water down and add the resilience narrative to their Black stories, Black women still also need to see representation that allows them to find the joys of their trauma in Black storytelling, as The Color Purple does. Yes, some will definitely only see what is sadly on the surface in this musical, which I don't think we can control. But Black women with their double consciousness will probably see more. And I think that's just as important, which is why I think that I'd cite it as a Black musical. In conclusion, of course, The Color Purple is definitely a Black musical because of its ties to Alice Walker and her characters, which are so ingrained in their Black womanhood that it's hard to remove them, even though we might try. It's, of course, got its issues, and it's complicated, but what musical on this list of the series, besides The Wiz, isn't complicated? What makes this show iconic as a Black musical is that an audience member cannot remove The Color Purple from the complicated history of Black American women. At its core, it's about Black women being the only people who we rely on to make us feel wanted and loved, no matter how hard they try to remove it. What I'm saying, in conclusion, is the Blackness in The Color Purple cannot be removed from its own self. Basically, you can try and extract Black women from The Color Purple, but you wouldn't really have The Color Purple. You would have something entirely different. I mean, this entire musical is through the lens of Blackness, regardless if they like it or not. That's just how it is. And yeah, in some parts it could be consumable Blackness, but in other parts I don't think that it could be. I think the thing about The Color Purple that's so interesting to me is that there's so much encoded Blackness that requires very specific audience members, specifically Black women, to understand it. So yeah, it is a Black musical. Again, you're allowed to disagree with me in the comments, and I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say, so let me know. That's it for today. I know it's complicated, but I think that's important. Being able to dissect and ask kind of complicated, paradoxical questions is just as essential as anything else. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you learned something and that you enjoyed this episode. Tune in next week as we will be discussing the ways in which alternative Black history exists in the musical Passing Strange.